I see what we need to do. Going live now. Good evening and welcome to another Gretaphors, another live stream by Friends of Science Society. I'm Michelle Stirling and I will be your presenter for the evening. Hi. There I am. Sorry. We've had some technical problems because I updated my computer to Windows 11 and all of a sudden quite a few things were not very compatible anymore. But we're going to continue with the presentation this evening, and I want to show you a few different things, some statisticulation as we call it, that will help you understand some of the ins and outs of climate science and climate hysteria that we think people should know about, because it really will calm you down and it'll calm down all your friends and family as well. So there we go. So Greta, of course, one of the things that people are really afraid of is that Greta told people, I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear that I feel every day. But that's not really what she meant. Here she was at the World Economic Forum. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. And our house is on fire. Now these comments went around the world. They were headline news everywhere. And the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Madrid even gave Greta Thunberg and Louisa Neubauer center stage, and they called it Unite Behind the Science event. So this is very public material, and yet in April of 2021, when Greta was called to testify before the US Congress, and now no longer a 16-year-old girl but an 18-year-old girl of legal age, when Congressman Norman said to her, what particular study or science made you come to this conclusion, I want you to panic, she said, well, let me clear that up. Those are metaphors. Of course I don't mean literally that I want people to panic, so there was no scientific study that made me come to that conclusion. Well, you'd think that that would be headline news, but it's not. Because the media just love a hot headline. The only thing that the media love is to be able to scare people. And they even have a group of 400 media outlets operating under the theme of covering climate now and reaching some 2 billion people. But almost nothing that they cover is science. It's all scaremongering. See, panic time. Under the weather. Good grief. The biggest story we've ever known. So it's really a shame that the media are complicit in scaring the pants off people. So this theme tonight is about climate statisticulation. That's the use of numbers in a way manipulated to scare people, and how it leads to public fear and poor public policy. Now, Hans Rosling, who was a medical doctor and also a public health expert, who was actually on the front lines of Ebola, he recounts in the book Factfulness that he had many instances in his medical career and public health career where he himself made very serious mistakes because of fear and urgency. And he tells us that fear and urgency leads to stupid, drastic decisions with unpredictable side effects. And that's really what we're seeing in the world of climate change and climate emergency. So we're going to look at some of the statistics that scare people and break them down in a way that won't scare you anymore. And this term statisticulation comes from the Daryl Huff book, How to Lie with Statistics. And this was written back in the 40s, but it's still a great little book. You can find it online. What is statisticulation? It's misinforming people by the use of statistical material, which might be called statistical manipulation, in a word, though not a very good one, statisticulation. And here's a famous example of climate statisticulation, the 97% consensus. So here we have Al Gore and his famous statement that 0 scientists disagreed with anthropogenic global warming. Well, Dr. Benny Pizer reran Oresky's research, and he showed that only 13 of all of these studies explicitly agreed with anthropogenic global warming, and most of them had no position whatsoever. They simply mentioned the words global warming or climate change. Here's another famous study, Doran and Zimmerman, 2009. So this was an opinion survey, and these were the 2 opinions asked. And the problem with asking an opinion on climate change is that it's a scientific topic. And if you look at the questions, they're very loosey-goosey. Is human activity a significant factor in global warming? Well, how much is significant? Has the Earth warmed since pre-1800s? Well, yeah, but that doesn't tell us a thing about greenhouse gas-induced warming. So they sent out the survey to a pool of 10,000 Earth scientists. 3,000 responded, but just 79 scientists of unknown qualification, but who said they were publishing on climate, were selected. And they answered the 2 opinion questions. 76 and 77 said yes, creating the 97% consensus. Now, more than 35 scientists sent emails to M.K. Zimmerman explaining that the sun drives climate change. So that sounds like perhaps not a 97% consensus. And Zimmerman herself said after doing all this work, and you can see this right in her thesis, I can honestly say that I've heard very convincing arguments from all the different sides, and I think I'm actually more neutral on the issue now than I was before I started this project. So the 97% consensus in her own study did not convince her. Now, we've done quite a bit of work on the 97% consensus. We deconstructed all of the major surveys, and it's in this report that's on our main website. And one of the things to remember is that the 97% consensus is what's called a social proof that creates a herd mentality, and the 3% are automatically ostracized. So Robert Cialdini is a very famous author on the subject of influence, and he talks about the social proof and how powerful that is on human emotion and intellect. And also Kipling D. Williams is a psychologist who's written a lot about ostracism and how painful that is for most people to be ostracized, to be left out. And so these 2 figures really work in concert, one creating a group mentality where people automatically want to be on board, to go along to get along, and the other where you have to be a very strong-willed person to be willing to stand up to this herd of 97% consensus sayers and be willing to say, well, you know what, I have a dissenting view. I have a rational dissenting view on climate, and I'm going to discuss it. Now here's another very popular climate statisticulation, and that is Canada's warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. Well, oddly enough, Singapore is heating up twice as fast as the planet, and the Northeast is also warming faster than the global average, and Tibet is warming twice the global average. So of course, in terms of math, everywhere in the world cannot be warming up at twice the rate of the average. So this is nothing but statisticulation meant to induce fear in people. And I should mention here, these are all done by a person on Twitter called DawnTJ90. So she's done a great job of that, and I thank her for letting us use them. Another statistic, we only have 12 years left. This came out just shortly after the 2018 IPCC SR 1.5 report, but in fact, that's not what the report said at all. And here's the co-chair of the report and professor of sustainable energy told them the panel did not say we have 12 years left to save the world. And another co-author, Christy L. Ebby, said the report never said we only have 12 years left. Well, now, I mean, I think some people are down to 4 years left, but the report never said that in the first place. So this Christmas, you can give your friends and family the gift of climate relief just by telling them that the climate emergency is over and we do have time. Because not only is it not a 12-year deadline or even a 4-year deadline, we're not using this RCP 8.5 anymore. And as you can see, it's pretty much smooth sailing without that catastrophic scenario in the picture. Now, there were a number of very eminent scientists who spoke out about this climate deadline. They were very concerned that it was dangerous, that it might cause authoritarianism in governments, that it might lead people to take dramatic and ridiculous and dangerous action. And we've seen that lately. We've seen that with Extinction Rebellion. We've seen that with Extinction Rebellion. We've seen that with Dr. Suzuki recently talking about people, attacking infrastructure. Extinction Rebellion is even calling for harming public officials. These are terrible, terrible things, but most of it is stemming from this fear. And I do believe that many people legitimately are afraid that there is some kind of an extinction imminent. But as you've seen, that's all based on statisticulation. That's not what the scientists are saying. So it's really important that we calm everything down, that we have a rational discussion about climate, and that we don't get carried away by all these fears. So why can't we have a reasoned debate? Well, climate activists are everywhere. They're in the media and they're in IPCC reports even, if you can believe it. So of course, Greenpeace is great at doing big public stunts. So is Extinction Rebellion. This is Catherine Abreu. She's frequently quoted in the press. She was the executive director of CANRAC, which is a group of over 100 ENGOs in Canada and unions. All of them dedicated to climate change mantras and climate change initiatives. She's now the head of Destination Net Zero, or part of it. I think she's a key part of it. But you see here, even at the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is supposed to be so objective and scientific, Donna Laframboise found that there are professional activists there actually writing IPCC science reports. So, it's pervasive. And of course, these people all look at the catastrophic side. And why? Because it's a great way to raise money. And lots of money. These are from some reports that we published in 2019, just to give you an idea of the financial power of environmental groups and climate groups in Canada. So the revenues received by the ENGOs and their environmental law counterparts over this period of time, 2000 to 2018, was 18 times the revenues received by all federal political parties. And remember, almost all of these groups are tax subsidized. So you're paying for them to block your job, to block your workplace, to up your carbon taxes, and probably unwillingly. And the revenue received by the Tides organization alone is more than the combined revenues of Canada's two largest federal political parties. And Tides has been implicated in Canada in the tar sands campaign, which has been a green trade war against Canada, blocking pipelines and resource development all across the country and fomenting Indigenous action using ENGOs as a kind of silent partners in the background. And we see a lot of that still going on. So these are the reports I'm referring to. They're online. Have a look at them. And this is one from the States. This is by Matthew Nisbet. And he's talking about all the big green philanthropies in the United States. And how they've been trying to push cap and trade. And to have cap and trade, of course, you need a price on carbon, and that's your carbon tax. So the carbon tax is not about you saving the planet. It's about these guys getting rich. Now, that's a bit on the activist side of things, but statisticulation also occurs in the world of climate science, if you can believe it. So here's some bits and pieces that might make you feel a little less concerned once we've gone through them. So these are two different tweets from NASA GISS. That's the Goddard Institute for Space Sciences. And you can see the Earth here is painted all red at the top. And you can see even down here in Antarctica, it's all red. So these red highlights to the average viewer look terrifying. But in fact, they're just trying to show there's a slight anomaly there. And what is GIS temp? This is from their website. This explains a bit about this temperature data system. It's the estimated temperature anomaly history, which is the difference between a month's actual temperature and the average of the corresponding months over the 30 years from 1951 to 1981, which right there, that's deceptive, because 1951 was a period when temperatures dropped, actually. So there was a low period. So this obviously would accentuate any warming or perceived warming. But what's important is that anomalies are not actual temperature data. And in terms of basic terminologies, what are the anomalies and why would they prefer them over absolute temperatures? Well, they say temperature anomalies indicate how much warmer or colder it is than normal for a particular place and time. For the GIS analysis, normal always means the average over the 30-year period from 1951 to 1980 for that place and time of the year. So actually, they arbitrarily chose this time as what is considered to be normal. And then, as I mentioned, you can see the red color adds quite a bit of drama. But of course, there are dissenting scientists like Dr. John Christie, Dr. Richard Lindzen, and they disagree with this temperature anomaly record. They think that it's flawed, and they have this report which you can read, and it will explain why. Or you can watch our video. We did a short video of this report if you prefer to hear the spoken word. And let's have another look at the GIS surface temperature analysis. So people are wondering why they use an anomaly and not the absolute surface air temperature. And these are a couple of explanations. First of all, the author from NASA GISS says, I doubt there's general agreement on what surface air temperature is. Which sounds pretty funny when you're talking about scientists. You'd think they'd all agree on this thing. But he says even at the same location, the temperature near the ground may be very different from the temperature 5 feet above the ground, and different again from 10 feet or 50 feet above the ground. To measure the surface air temperature, we would have to agree on what it is. And as far as I know, there's no such standard has been suggested or generally adopted. So then there's another question. What do we mean by the daily mean surface air temperature? Again, there's no universally accepted correct answer. Should we note the temperature every 6 hours and report the mean or the average? Should we do it every 2 hours or hourly? Well, you know, before I read this, I was thinking, wow, they must have very fixed and precise monitoring of Earth's temperature, but now it seems like it's kind of loosey-goosey. And then the question is, what surface air temperature do local media report? Well, the media report the reading of one particular thermometer of a nearby weather station. To measure the true regional surface air temperature, we would have to use as many 50-foot stacks of thermometers distributed evenly over the whole region, an obvious practical impossibility. So that's kind of crazy, isn't it? If you look on our YouTube channel, I recently did a short little video where I took a whole bunch of thermometers and polar bears out into the park and tested to see what the surface air temperature was within a very short distance. And believe it or not, with about 5 or 6 thermometers within a very small area, there was a 22-degree temperature differential. So when people tell you that we should try to meet a Paris target of maintaining the Earth's temperature below 2 degrees and preferably below 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise, you know, that once you've done that experiment, you'll find that it's pretty hard to believe that we can do that, and it's pretty hard to believe that we're not being snowed about it. So let's see what else we have in statisticulation. Oh, here's one. Here's the World Meteorological Organization in 2016, where it claimed that 2016 was the hottest year on record. And look how red the globe is. Look at that. Everything's burning up. Our house is on fire. But what if the title said, World Meteorological Organization confirms 2016 was 0.02 of a degree warmer than 2017? Would people be so freaked out? I don't think so. So this is from the late Professor Dr. Istvan Marko, a wonderful scientist. Great loss to the world that he's gone. And he said the World Meteorological Organization, another emanation of the United Nations, and which is also, like the IPCC, an intergovernmental forum, declared 2016 to be the year the warmest in history. Knowing that 2016 is supposedly hotter by 2/100ths of a degree Celsius than 2015, and that the margin of error on this value is 1/10 of a degree Celsius, we see the absurdity of this statement. For those who don't immediately understand it, this means the variation in temperature could be plus 0.12 degrees Celsius global warming or minus 0.08 degrees Celsius global cooling. In short, we can't say anything, and the WMO has simply lost its mind. And more recently, in the most recent IPCC report, this shows the cover of the Summary for Policymakers. This is about a 40-page booklet that summarizes the 4,000-page scientific document. And what features prominently in it is this hockey stick graph, which does look scary, doesn't it? I mean, it looks like temperature was very stable for a long time. Humans came along and boom, it got really hot. But this graph does not appear anywhere in the scientific document. And Steve McIntyre of Climate Audit looked at the original data that forms the shaft of this stick, and he found that the scientists involved had simply found suitable little bits and pieces of data that showed a flat line from various places around the world, and then they stitched them all together to make the shaft of this stick. Whereas if you looked at all the data from any one of these locations, there are variations, but they just conveniently clipped those out. So that's a kind of statisticulation too. And how about if the media get the math right? So we did this press release some years ago. We couldn't believe it, really. Reuters math error creates 10 times the global warming in Exxon story. So Reuters incorrectly reported that the world temperatures might rise by 35.6 degrees Fahrenheit because Reuters used a Celsius Fahrenheit conversion instead of stating the temperature change equivalencies of 2 degrees Celsius, which turned out to be only 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, we issued this as a press release and went all across North America. We tweeted it to Reuters a few times, and this story is still wrong on Reuters. So let's just take a pause for a moment and think. Is climate change real? Yes, it is. Do humans contribute to it? Yes, we do. We contribute through GHG emissions, through land use, through water diversion, agriculture, deforestation, and urban heat islands. But we do not control it. So the IPCC itself, in one of its early reports, said in climate research and modeling, we should recognize that we're dealing with a coupled, nonlinear, chaotic system, and therefore long-term prediction of future climate states is not possible. It's not possible. And you can see why. Here are many or most of the chaotic elements that are interacting with each other, that are affecting other things down here, which in turn affect other things here. You can see how chaotic and complex this system is. It's very hard to believe that our contribution in atmospheric composition could be the sole factor that would control all of these other items. We certainly have an effect on climate, but we don't control it. And of course, climate change is real. If we want to look at a graph that is a better representation than the hockey stick graph, this is probably one. So you can see that in Holocene optimum, the Roman climate optimum, the medieval warm period, and the modern warm period, civilization flourished. In the cold periods, like the Little Ice Age and the Dark Ages, in the Dark Ages, civilization was almost wiped out. In the Little Ice Age, it was terrifyingly cold. There were lots of famines, lots of crop failures, and in one instance, it was so cold that birds dropped dead from the sky. And I'm actually, I'm just reading a book right now about temperature changes and weather events throughout history. And in the Swiss Alps, there's a whole section in there about how the glaciers came down from the Alps and encroached on towns and villages, and occasionally completely wiping them out, because the word debacle actually comes from the French term for the end of a glacier snapping off and crushing a village. It's a debacle when it, and this actually really happened many times. And when you read about how the villagers were so afraid of the advance of these glaciers that they brought in priests to go and pray and spread holy water on the glaciers trying to stop them. I mean, these were terrifying times in the Little Ice Age, and we will probably go into another solar minimum and have similar effects, but the fact that we have modern society and fossil fuels, that's the thing that's made it possible for us to adapt and survive these terrible cyclical weather patterns, climate patterns that that's our lot in life, living on Earth. Now, another thing, when people say, you know, it's the hottest year in the past 170 years, well, you have to know that there were not very many thermometers back in the 1860s. They were not equidistantly distributed, and they're still not equidistantly distributed to this day. And also, since the oceans are 71% of the Earth's surface, they have a huge effect on Earth's temperature. And today, there are Argo drones floating around. There's about 4,000 of them, distributed every 3 degrees, or about every 300 kilometers. But that's still not very good coverage of the Earth, because there are different kinds of ocean currents, cold and warm. And we only have about 2 decades of Argo data. It's obviously better than nothing, but we never had that before. So, you know, most of the early records are from proxies, and they're not that reliable, certainly not within hundredths of a degree. So here is the global annual temperature from the Hadley Climate Research Unit. That's in England. And this was put together by Ken Gregory, our research director, from their data set. And you can see that there is a rise in temperature. Yeah, So there has been some warming. And it looks kind of significant, doesn't it? But if you look at this side of the graph, you can see, wait a minute, those are very small measurements, increments. What happens if you look at it on a different scale? Well, somehow it doesn't look that scary, does it? And you can see that Canada has a 50 degrees Celsius seasonal range in Canada between winter and summer. So half a degree of difference doesn't look very scary. This is from Dr. Soon's presentation, and he says that he's 100% confident that it's impossible to find CO2 warming in Canadian records. So how do we come up with these scary forecasts? Well, Dr. Ross McKittrick has done a lot of work on this, and the thing that's driving it is climate models and simulations. And climate models are computer simulations, and they're made by people. So they're very complex mathematical formulas, and they've been very, very useful in teaching us more and more about climate and how different factors affect climate. But the problem is the models are faulty, in part because they're made by humans and in part because of the way they're constructed. It's impossible to measure every element that affects climate. And we have a piece on our blog about this, actually. We have a really fun and interesting piece by Professor Christopher Essex, who co-wrote a book with Professor McKittrick. Anyway, it's called Caveman Climate and Computers. And it's in it, Christopher Essex talks about the fact that to do an accurate 10-year forecast, the computer models would need the age of the universe squared to run all the data. And that would still exclude the unexpected things like volcanic eruptions or solar flares or very unexpected changes in ocean currents. So that gives you an idea that the computer models are not actually that accurate because they're not running for the age of the universe squared. And here's another thing about computer models. These are, this spaghetti graph is a whole bunch of computer model runs, and you can see the black line, that's the average. You can see that they all go up. But starting around around 1997 or so, they started to really diverge from reality. So this is the satellite measurements here along the bottom, and they're paired with weather balloon measurements, and you can see that the weather balloon and the satellite measurements are pretty close. And the temperatures are flatlining, but the models are going up and up and up and up, predicting very hot warming. So climate policies are being set on these models rather than on these observations. And another thing that I've added onto this graph is that you can notice where the consensus studies started popping up. When there was significant divergence and it didn't look like these two lines were going to come back together again, suddenly we had all these consensus studies show up trying to prove that everyone agreed there was terrible global warming on the horizon. So you can see they all show up in sequence, but the models still go up and the temperatures flatline. And just for Canadians, this is an excerpt from a Judith Curry blog post, and in it she's quoting some authors on a study about models and also a comment from Ross McKittrick. So the comment from the authors says, a special prize goes to the Canadian model, we draw attention to the CAN-ESM-5 model, it simulates the greatest warming in the troposphere, roughly 7 times larger than the observed trends. Well, no wonder people are scared if they're looking at that. The Canadian government relies on the CAN-ESM models to provide, quote, science-based quantitative information to inform climate change adaptation and mitigation in Canada and internationally. And then McKittrick's quote says, I would be very surprised if the modelers at University of Victoria ever put warning labels on their briefings to policymakers. The sticker should read, warning, this model predicts atmospheric warming roughly 7 times larger than observed trends. Use of this model for anything other than entertainment purposes is not recommended. So that means your carbon taxes are far too high because all of the economic models are calibrated to climate models. So I'll be posting this PowerPoint on our blog as well, so that you can go through and look at the links, and you can look at the links for these studies. And all 4 studies indicate that the model's climate sensitivity, or the warming effect, to GHGs is far too high. So your carbon taxes are far too high. Now, a different kind of statisticulation arises from definition. And this is where we have to ask the question, is human-caused climate change dangerous? Well, there's 2 different political definitions, and you end up with 2 different kind of answers for policy, depending on which one you pick. And Roger Pielke Jr. did a great paper on this in 2005. So the political definition of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that's the group that has these COP meetings all the time, states that the convention's objective is the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So that's what all those COP meetings are about. But the actual scientific definition of climate change from the IPCC is climate change refers to a change in the state of climate that can be identified with statistical tests, and that persists for an extended period, typically decades or longer. And they note that climate change may be due to natural internal processes or external forcings, such as modulations of the solar cycles, volcanic eruptions, and persistent anthropogenic changes in the composition of the atmosphere or in land use. So wait a minute, these guys, the scientists, don't say anything about dangerous. It's only in the political definition that we see they've already in 1992 decided that the outcome would be dangerous. But it doesn't look like it's dangerous today. Except, of course, if you're Antonio Guterres. So when the newest IPCC report came out, he issued a press release saying the IPCC report is a code red for humanity. But actually, Roger Pielke Jr., who's read the whole scientific report with a critical eye, he says instead of apocalyptic warnings about immediate risk, the top line message of this report should be, great news! The extreme scenario that the IPCC saw as most likely in 2013 is now judged low likelihood. I am actually floored that this incredible change in such a short time apparently hasn't even been noticed, much less broadcast around the world. Roger Pielke Jr. Well, I'm pretty surprised too. Now, he's been working on this for a long time, and he's the person principally who noted that most of the scary predictions are based on a scenario called RCP 8.5 and also on outdated science. And he's got a very interesting kind of plain language blog that you can read, talking about how scientists have just continued to use this RCP 8.5, which is the scariest and most implausible scenario, and which was never meant for public policy. And they've just been building on this, and so consequently every report that comes out using this scenario comes out as something scary and catastrophic. And he and his colleague Justin Ritchie, also from Canada, did this paper, Distorting the View of our Climate Future, the Misuse and Abuse of Climate Pathways and Scenarios. So I strongly recommend that you have a look at those. But in short, here is the essence of it. This is what he said: great news, the extreme scenario the IPC saw as most likely is now a low likelihood. This is that scary scenario. It's off the table. The climate emergency is over. We do have time. That's how I read it. And if you see here, even if we were in RCP 6.0, that would not be terrifying. But in fact, none of these were ever intended to be used for setting policy. They were only used to be used for research purposes. And we can see that there were 25 COP conferences of the parties, and they didn't result in a reduction in carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. And COP26 just finished in Glasgow. More promises, but it looks like CO2 is going up. And you know what? Not all of it is from human emissions. That's very important. A lot of it comes from nature. Now, Bjorn Lomborg has written a book that will also calm people down a lot. It's called False Alarm, and he's got lots of very practical suggestions in there, how we could better use our money, how we could elevate the poor, and how we could all have a nice life, and how wasting money on wind farms and such like will never fix the planet, never address environmental issues, and it will do nothing for climate change. And again, here he ran the computer models to see what would happen if all countries met their Paris target promises, and the reduction in warming would be 0.05 of a degree Celsius by 2100. So that's immeasurable. No one would notice that. There'd be no public benefit and no benefit to climate. And of course, everyone's talking about net zero after COP26, but here's the reality check. You can see that in the era of climate diplomacy, global fossil fuel consumption increased by 57%. And this was done in 2017, but it's a very similar scenario. To reduce global fossil fuel use by 90% by 2050, we would require the reduction of 1 million tons of oil equivalent energy per day, every day, till 2050. And this is what constitutes the equivalent of 1 million tons of oil equivalent energy. And this report by Robert Lyman further explains why renewable energy cannot replace fossil fuels by 2050. And furthermore, will we reach net zero 2050? Well, actually, the US Energy Information Administration says no, and not just because people don't want to, but also because most countries in the world want more oil, gas, and coal. They want to develop. Emissions in the non-OECD countries, the developing nations, in 2050 will be 35% above 2020 levels, up 7.9 billion tons, compared with a 5% growth in the OECD countries, like the Western developed nations. So that's going up 35%, while our growth is only 5%. So in other words, the Outlook report finds that even after Western governments spent over $1 trillion per year over 30 years and severely impair their own economic well-being pursuing the goal of reduced global GHG emissions, those emissions will likely increase by over 8 billion tons per year. The net zero target won't just be missed. The extremely costly efforts to achieve it will be utterly inconsequential to the world's climate outcomes. And you're unlikely to see this reported in the media, which is very true. So next time you hear something that's a climate catastrophe, just think of it as a Gretaphor. Think about climate statisticulation and some of the tips that I've shared with you this evening, and be calm and press on. It's time for us to push for some climate reason in the world. And just to let you know, Friends of Science is an independent group of Earth, atmospheric, and solar scientists. We're now going into our 20th year of offering climate science insights. We are funded by our member subscribers. We operate on about $150,000 a year. We do not accept government grants, and we don't represent any industry, but we'd be very happy to have more members and more donations. So if you'd like to send us a little Christmas present, we'd be happy to take it. We had one of our commentators on one of our live streams said, wow, you guys have 43,000 subscribers on YouTube. It'd be great if everybody just sent you $12, and that would really help you with your funding, and it really would. So that would be like $1 a month. So if you want, you could do an e-transfer to contact@friendsofscience.org, or you can go onto our main website and you can make a donation or become a member there. And if you become a member, then you get all of our newsletters. We do a CLI-SCI, which is a roundup of climate science updates and new papers, things that you don't see reported in the press, and also extracts, which is a roundup of IPCC and policy-related material from around the world. Again, neither of those you'll see in the mainstream, and these are done by our dedicated volunteers, and these are bi-monthly publications. So that's just some of what we offer you, but we also offer you many reports and our videos, of course, and we'll keep doing it anyway. But if you can help us out, we'd be very happy. And we're just coming up to the end of our presentation here now. I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in. Thank you to our subscribers, to our members, and thank you for sharing our material. And again, I'd like to say that we're not interested in indoctrinating people. We're interested in advocating for open civil debate. We think that many of the problems in society today are due to the fact that there hasn't been open civil debate. There hasn't been full cost-benefit analysis of these very important public policy issues. And that's what we're pushing for, is open civil debate and full cost-benefit analysis. And we'd like you to be standing up with us. We'd like you to share our materials with your policymakers, friends, and families, so that people can be informed and see that there is another perspective, that the scope of climate science is much broader than the single focus on carbon dioxide, and also that the costs of some of these proposed policies are astronomical and the benefits are very questionable. So that's our story for this evening, our little story about Gretaphors. So I don't want you to panic. As Nomi Sight would say, I want you to think. I hope you have a good evening, have a Merry Christmas, have a Happy New Year, and thank you very much for supporting Friends of Science and for tuning in tonight. Good night, everyone.